Hello everyone and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth and in today's video I will be doing the Victorian Literature Tag. I absolutely love this tag. So many of my favorite booktubers have done it, and in fact it has been floating around booktube ever since Victober started, so for a good 5-6 years now. And if you're curious about this tag, I will link all of the questions below. So grab your favorite beverage as we discuss Victorian literature. Question number 1 is, what is the first piece of Victorian literature that you ever read? And already I'm going to cheat a little bit and say A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I love this book so much. It's one of my favorite books, one of my favorite childhood classics, and it doesn't get more Victorian than A Little Princess. However, it was technically published in 1905, so shortly after Queen Victoria's death in 1901. However, the heart of this story is Victorian. The original story, the original manuscript of Sarah Crewe and what happened at Miss Minchin's was originally published in a children's magazine, and then they published it in book format in 1888. So check right at the tail end of the Victorian period. Then what happened was Sarah Crewe became a famous stage play in both London and New York, and then her publishers asked her to go back and take Sarah Crewe and kind of revamp it and flesh it out, and that's why we have this edition of Little Princess that we have today. That's not Victorian enough for you. This book was actually inspired by an unfinished novel by Charlotte Bronte called Emma, and in the story of Emma, it was about a young, mysterious heiress that went to go live at a girls' boarding school. So I'm so happy that Frances Hodgson Burnett took the story, revamped it, and turned it into the story of Little Princess that we have today. The plot as well is very Victorian, all about a little orphan who is penniless and is roaming the streets of London, very Dickensian, until one day a mysterious benefactor comes to her rescue. I absolutely love this story, and I do credit it as making me love all of Victorian literature. So I don't feel like I would be talking about the rest of the books I'm going to be talking about today if it was not for A Little Princess. Speaking of Charlotte Bronte, my favorite Victorian novel is actually my favorite novel, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I have talked about this book before as being my favorite book. I love Jane Eyre. It's one of those books I have to reread every couple of years. And these days I just completely skip Gateshead and Lowood and I dive right into the good stuff when Jane becomes a governess at Thornfields Hall. I love this book so much because not only is it a beautiful romance between Jane and Mr. Rochester, two very imperfect people that find each other, but it's also a fantastic book just because of Jane herself, the main character. She is such a fierce, independent character, and she really stays true to her values and her standards and her morals in this book, and she is not afraid to stand up to other characters and kind of push back. And you see that right from the beginning when she's a child, how she fights back against her cruel aunt and her cousins, and then also during the Lowood years when she stands up to some of the evil teachers like Mr. Brocklehurst, and then again during the Thornfield years when she's with Mr. Rochester. And even at the end of the book, she kind of tells John Rivers, back off, leave me alone, there's no way in heck I'm ever gonna marry you. So I really enjoy this book so much, and again, it's always been a favorite of mine. Question number 3 is, who is your favorite Victorian author? So besides Charlotte Bronte, one of my newest favorite Victorian authors is Anthony Trollope, and I have been slowly working my way through the Barsetshire Chronicles for the last couple of years. This is the first in the series, The Warden by Anthony Trollope. I really love Trollope's writing. It's very cozy, very charming. There's always a lot of really fun characters, a lot of sweet romances. His writing is also very satirical and political. I do recommend Trollope if there's anyone out there like me who's not a huge fan of Charles Dickens. Don't get me wrong, I love Charles Dickens too. I think he's a genius. All of his books that I've read so far are fantastic. But Charles Dickens can be a little much sometimes, a little over the top. His characters are certainly over the top, and his plots are crazy. Where I think if Charles Dickens is just a little much for you, I do recommend Anthony Trollope. He's just as smart as Dickens. In fact, I would argue he's a little smarter than Dickens, but his books are a little more sedate. They're just a little more meandering and cozy and easygoing. But you're not sacrificing on wit and intelligence and political satire either. I absolutely love Anthony Trollope. If you would like to get started with Trollope, I do recommend starting with The Warden in the Barsetshire Chronicles. At first I thought this book was going to be a really boring, a placeholder. I really just wanted to get to Barchester Towers, which is the second book and the most famous. But The Warden, I ended up loving this book. It's a sweet little story about this little clergyman named Mr. Harding, and everyone in the town accuses him of making too much money, that his church salary is too much. And so what happens is basically the man that's accusing him and all the politicians that are accusing him, John Bold, is also falling in love with Mr. Harding's daughter, Eleanor. And so just this relationship between Mr. Harding, his beloved daughter, Eleanor, and then John Bold, who is madly in love with Eleanor. It is just the cutest, sweetest little trifecta in literature. At the same time, I love a lot of the other characters. My favorite character in all of the Barsetshire Chronicles is Dr. Grantley. He's also a clergyman, and he's really conservative and very wealthy, and he has no qualms at all of collecting a very high church salary. So again, fantastic book, and I highly recommend, if you're interested in Trollope, to start with The Warden. Question number 4 is your favorite Victorian literary couple. And for me, that would be the couple in Far From the Maddening Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I really enjoyed this book as well. It was my first Thomas Hardy, but believe me, it will not be my last because I really, really loved the main character, Bathsheba Everdeen. So I can't exactly tell you who Bathsheba gets together with, the man in this relationship, because it would be a spoiler. Bathsheba basically has to choose between 3 potential suitors in this book, so I don't want to give it away if you have not read it, but it is absolutely fantastic. The story is about Bathsheba Everdeen, and she is a wealthy heiress. She basically inherits this farm at the beginning of the book from her uncle. And rather than just resting on her laurels, she decides to take an active role in the farm and become a businesswoman in the community where she lives. So she's out there bossing around all the farm hands, and then she's negotiating with the other farmers. She is a real proper businesswoman in this book. And obviously that attracts the attention of potential suitors who are after her for her money because she's a wealthy heiress. It's really, really good. And her and this guy in the book, the person she ends up with, they go through so much, so many trials and tribulations. There's so many moments in this book where you're like, no, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe they did that. But it all comes together so beautifully at the end. And so when that ending comes, it's just so rewarding. And of course, Thomas Hardy spoils it with some like really tacky, kooky comedy at the end. But that's chapter right before the last chapter is really good, and I'm glad the movie version fixed it. I love this book, and for all you feminists out there, you cannot go wrong with Bathsheba Everdeen and Far From the Maddening Crowd. She is right up there with Jane and Elizabeth Bennet, in my opinion. Question number 5 is, who is your favorite Victorian villain? And at first I was going to go with Uriah Heep from David Copperfield. I don't think anyone does Victorian villains as well as Charles Dickens. He's just the best. All of his characters are really crazy. But then I thought about it for a little bit, and then I decided to go with Count Fosco from The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. And basically there's only 2 reasons to read A Woman in White. The first reason is Marianne Halcombe. She, again, is one of my favorite female characters in all of Victorian literature. She is the best, in the section of this book, the middle section where she's the narrator, is the reason you should read this book. She's fantastic. The second reason you would want to read The Woman in White is for the villain, Count Fosco. Count Fosco is the perfect mustache twirling Victorian villain. He is absolutely the best. He's so sneaky and slimy, and it's really hard to catch him in the act. He's one of those characters that is very gregarious in the life of the party when he is around people, but then on the sidelines he's doing some really sinister stuff behind the scenes. And I also really like how Wilkie Collins describes his character. He's this very heavy-set man. He dresses really well, very posh, and he's always the life of the party, playing the piano and singing and all this stuff. But his best characteristic is he has this whole menagerie of animals around him all the time. So whenever he's doing something particularly sinister, he'll just like pull a mouse out of his pocket, or he has like a bird perched on his shoulder, or this cat or dog following him around. He is just my favorite character, and he's so good that you actually start rooting for Count Fosco more than you do the protagonists in this book. I love Count Fosco. He is the best Victorian villain, in my opinion. Question number 6 is your favorite Victorian book where someone dies of consumption. Very wink wink, tongue in cheek, because it does seem like a lot of people die in Victorian novels, and death is very important in Victorian novels. I think the Victorians just had a healthier attitude towards death, not only because people died younger, but it does seem like a lot of the main characters in Victorian novels are dead characters, that dead characters and death drives the plot of Victorian novels. And I went back and looked up what consumption actually was, and at first I thought it was cancer, but it is actually tuberculosis. And that makes sense because tuberculosis was a long, lingering disease. If you want to find out the Victorians' ideal of beauty, of being glassy-eyed and thin and pale and fainting, it's really creepy because it goes back to the symptoms of tuberculosis. There's also a lot of lingering death scenes, a lot of deathbed confessions and things like that. And the typical way that Victorian authors use death is that, okay, the main character starts out as an orphan. His beloved parents die of consumption. Then he's thrown out into the mean, cruel streets of London all by himself, and he has to make it out in the world. And everything's going wrong until at the very end, some mysterious benefactor dies and leaves him a boatload of money. And then he uses all that money to marry the love of his life. And I think no other author does that better than Charles Dickens. So the book that I'd like to mention for this question is Great Expectations. I don't know if someone dies of consumption in this book, but there are a lot of deaths in this book. In fact, the very first scene takes place in a graveyard where Pip is sitting on his mother and his father's gravestones, and then he's looking at all his baby brothers and sisters. Their graves are all around there as well. So I'm not sure if the parents died of consumption, but I'm just assuming one of them did. And it's at the graveyard where he first meets Magwitch, and that just kind of drives the plot of the rest of the novel. Also, the scenes with Miss Havisham are very gothic, very ghostly, and they pertain to death a lot as well, and they invoke that feeling of death. A very, very interesting book, and I do think it describes that whole orphan trope very well. And it is, Great Expectations is really one of my favorite books by Charles Dickens. Question number 7 is the longest Victorian novel you have ever read, and there's certainly a lot of long Victorian novels, especially by Charles Dickens. I think Dombey and Sons or Bleak House comes to mind, but the longest Victorian novel that I have ever read is Middlemarch by George Eliot. And this is the Barnes and Noble edition, which is clocking in at 794 pages, so almost 800 pages. This is a long book, but George Eliot is so worth it. I absolutely love George Eliot. I've read a handful of her books now, and she's a really good writer. She's tough. She's hard. She's cynical. She's like a meaner, smarter version of the Brontes and Austen. But she is worth it. Her books, when you finish them, you just feel so rewarded. And that's certainly the case with Middlemarch. I really recommend Middlemarch for young people. I read this back in my 20s, and I think that was the perfect time to read it when you're starting out in life, making all these important decisions like who you're going to marry or what job you're going to do. That's basically what this book is about a lot of young, idealistic characters that think their life is going to pan out in a certain way. They have all these plans, but then they end up making some really poor decisions, especially when it comes to marriage, and they have to basically live with the consequences of those decisions. And some of the characters rise to the challenge and are good people, and some of the characters are not. And I love this book. It is a fantastic character study. And again, I think every young person should read Middlemarch. It's a fantastic book. Question number 8 is a Victorian author or novel that you feel is underrated, and I really just have one answer to this question, and that is Aurora Floyd by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I absolutely love this book. It has been a while since I read it. I read it back in college, but I just remember thinking this book was fantastic and like nothing I had ever read. It was such a surprise for me. This book can basically be summed up as a Victorian sensationalist novel, so I think that is again one of the challenges this year. So if you're looking for a Victorian sensationalist novel, this is a good one to pick. I also recommend this for people that think that classic literature, Victorian literature, is dry and boring and not much happens, because this book has it all. It has revenge and murder and adultery, and just a lot of crazy things are going on in this book. It also happens to have, though, another fantastic female character, and that's Aurora Floyd. Aurora Floyd is just this beautiful, smart, fierce, independent woman. And it starts off with her mother has died, so she's raised by a single, wealthy father. And he kind of spoils her. He basically lets her do whatever the heck she wants. And the scene that will stick in your mind with Aurora Floyd is Aurora on her horse. Just the way that Mary Elizabeth Braddon describes her riding her horse, of her flushed cheeks and her hair streaming wild. It just shows you how wild Aurora Floyd is. And she basically has all these men wrapped around her little finger. Her father, her husband, a lot of other men that she gets involved with. It's a fantastic book. I love it, and I think a lot of people would love it too. It's very underrated. Question number 9 is one of my favorites, and that is one of the most beautiful Victorian novels that you own. And as a book collector, again, I love collecting beautiful books. I love my folios. I love my Heritage Press books, but I especially love this edition of Jane Eyre by Thomas Nelson, again featuring the laser cut dust jackets. I've showed a couple of these editions in my videos, particularly Persuasion back in Jane Austen July. But I love these editions. They're so beautiful. I just love this idea of the laser cut dust jackets. They are so stunning. Obviously, when I read the book, I take the dust jacket off so it doesn't get ruined, but these editions are really easy to read as well. The font is nice and large and readable. And I am due for another reread of Jane Eyre soon. As I said, I like to read it every 2 or 3 years, and it'll be such a pleasure to reread Jane Eyre in this beautiful Thomas Nelson edition. Question number 10 is 3 unread Victorian novels that you would like to try next. And I'm not going to talk about any of the current books I'm reading for Victober because I have a whole wrap-up video planned for those books. So 3 other books I would like to try in the future are definitely Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I loved Aurora Floyd so much, and I really think that that book will be a lot of fun to read as well. I would also like to read more by Elizabeth Gaskell. The girls have chosen Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell as the group read for this year, and I'm so happy because now I can say, check, I've read some Elizabeth Gaskell. But this is just a collection of short stories. It really doesn't represent the main Elizabeth Gaskell books, so I would like to go back and read either North and South or Wives and Daughters. One of my favorite booktubers, Kate Howe, she is always gushing about Wives and Daughters, and I feel guilty every time she talks about it because, yeah, I really should read Wives and Daughters and get into Elizabeth Gaskell. She's an author I know I'm going to like. I just have not read any of her books. Happy to read Gothic Tales this year, though. I'd also like to read more Thomas Hardy. I mentioned how much I loved Far from the Maddening Crowd, and this one is Tess of D'Urberville. It is a Heritage Press book, very vintage, beautiful books. They have these woodcut illustrations by Agnes Miller Parker. And so I'm so happy to own these editions of Thomas Hardy's books, and Tess is the next Thomas Hardy I would like to read. I know this one is a little more tragic than Far from the Maddening Crowd. I do believe that it involves rape, and I think that would be interesting to see how Thomas Hardy and the Victorians handle that topic because that's such a difficult topic. It'd be interesting to see how the Victorians handle that. Looking forward to reading Tess of D'Urberville, and hopefully by the end of the year I can finish this one as well. Thank you everyone for joining me for my Victorian Literature Tag. I really enjoyed coming up with the answers to these questions. I absolutely love Victorian literature, and I love Victober. I love how we honor Victorian literature during this month every year. It's just a really special time to go back and read those books, those classic books that have been on your TBR forever. And it does seem that every year I discover a new favorite book or a new favorite author. So happy reading everyone, and happy Victober.